Remember those forgotten cooking tricks? The ones we once swore by, then stopped using? They got meals on the table fast, cheap, and with whatever was on hand. But what happens when we try them again, in a kitchen that's moved on? Potato chip casserole topping was one of those strange little tricks that somehow made dinner feel like a treat. Back in the day, people did not have access to fancy breadcrumbs or crunchy imported cheeses, and boxed mixes were still a novelty. But they almost always had a bag of plain potato chips sitting around, maybe a little stale, maybe half-eaten, maybe on sale. So when it came time to top a casserole, instead of breadcrumbs or fried onions, cooks reached for that crinkled bag, crushed it up in their hands, and sprinkled the pieces across the top. Into the oven it went, and out came something golden, salty, and unexpectedly satisfying. That simple potato chip crust made otherwise bland casseroles feel indulgent, and the trick was proudly passed down in community cookbooks, church bulletins, and lunchroom chatter. It was cheap, it was crunchy, and best of all, it used something people already had. There were even recipes that told you to mix the crushed chips with melted margarine or powdered cheese before baking, because if you were going to commit to a topping, you might as well go all in. There is just something so right about a casserole with a potato chip crown. Coffee can bread baking was born out of pure practicality, but it somehow felt a little magical too. If you had a clean empty can, anywhere from an old coffee tin to a leftover fruit cocktail can, you had yourself a bread pan. These cans were used for everything from banana bread to steamed Boston brown bread, and they gave each loaf that tall, round look you could not get from a standard pan. The inside of the can would be greased with bacon fat or butter, filled partway with dough, and then either baked or steamed depending on the recipe. The end result was a soft, rich bread with a golden crust and a shape that stood proud on the plate. Some cans were even reused again and again, passed down like family heirlooms, with their dents and scratches telling their own story. And when the bread came out, kids always thought it looked a little like cake. So of course it disappeared in minutes. Old cookbooks called these canned loaves or pantry tins, and for good reason. You made do with what you had, and the results were better than expected. Coffee cans made perfect pans, and no one thought twice about it. Mayonnaise as a cake moistener sounds like a cruel joke until you taste it. In the lean years, especially during the Great Depression and into the war era, people had to get creative when they were short on eggs, milk, or butter. Mayonnaise was made with all three, and it had a smooth, fatty texture that blended beautifully into batter. So when folks wanted to bake a cake but the fridge was bare, they reached for the mayo jar. Chocolate mayonnaise cake became a sleeper hit, especially in mid-century kitchens. It was rich, dark, and impossibly moist, with a texture that stayed soft even days after baking. Cookbooks started including mayo cakes as their own category, with variations that included nuts, cinnamon, or even applesauce. Brands caught on too. Some even printed the recipe on the side of their jars. You could always tell someone grew up during hard times if they looked at a cake and guessed the secret ingredient right away. To this day, some home bakers still swear it is the only way to make a chocolate cake that never dries out. Strange as it sounds, mayonnaise made cakes better, and no one questioned it. Boiled salad dressing was the grandmother of everything that came before the grocery aisle. Back before bottled ranch or ready-made vinaigrettes, home cooks whipped up dressings from scratch using what they had in the pantry. This particular one was a little tangy, a little sweet, and usually started with vinegar, sugar, egg yolks, and a bit of mustard powder. Everything was whisked together in a saucepan and cooked low until it thickened like a custard. The result was creamy and tart, perfect for potato salad, coleslaw, or even spooned over hard-boiled eggs. Some versions added flour or cornstarch to help it hold better in the fridge, while others kept it simple. It might not have had the smooth pour of modern dressings, but it had soul and a flavor people still remember. You would find it tucked into the back pages of church cookbooks, labeled Grandma's Dressing or Sweet Egg Sauce. When chilled, it firmed up a little, which made it ideal for picnic salads that had to last in the summer sun. It tasted like resourcefulness. It tasted like memory. and it was surprisingly good. Hot dog octopus garnish is what happens when creativity meets childhood joy. Mid-century party cookbooks, especially the ones aimed at birthday parties or school lunches, loved a good gimmick. And turning an ordinary hot dog into a smiling octopus? That was peak culinary fun for kids. The trick was simple. Slice one end of a hot dog into strips, boil it for a minute or two, and watch the legs curl outward like tentacles. The result was a goofy, wiggly hot dog that looked like it belonged in a cartoon and tasted like backyard summer. Parents would set them on top of mac and cheese, mashed potatoes, or even tuck them into lunchboxes with a smiley face drawn in mustard. It cost next to nothing but made kids feel like they were eating something special. These octopus dogs became so popular that some cookbooks devoted whole sections to fun food just like it. It was a different kind of food styling, one that made meals exciting without any fuss or frosting. And really, when you are 5 years old, who would not love a sea creature made of meat? Gelatin mold leftover savor might sound like a punishment today, but back then it was a point of pride. Once gelatin became affordable and easy to prepare, people found all kinds of ways to use it, especially as a vessel to stretch meals and make use of leftovers. You had a little ham, some canned peas, a scoop of last night's macaroni salad. Mix it all into lemon or tomato gelatin and pour it into a mold. Chill, unmold, and suddenly you had a centerpiece. It was cold. It was colorful. It was the future, or so they said. These savory gelatin molds were featured everywhere from homemaker magazines to government-sponsored nutrition guides. They promised frugality, beauty, and innovation all in one jiggly dish. Housewives with limited means could make a full meal look polished and party-ready. People even had specific molds for specific meals. Rings, domes, fish shapes, you name it. It may not have always tasted great, but it looked impressive. And that counted for something. Somewhere between waste, not, and show-off, gelatin found its niche. Salt-rubbed chicken skin crisping is one of those old-school tricks you try once and wonder why you ever stopped. Before nonstick pans and convection ovens, getting crispy skin was a real feat. One of the simplest ways to get there? Salt. Not a pinch, but a full rub down with coarse salt, left overnight in the fridge. It drew out moisture, dried the skin, and left it ready to blister and brown. You could add garlic or herbs if you had them, but you really did not need to. The trick worked best on whole chickens or thighs with the skin on. When it came out right, the skin cracked like a chip and packed serious flavor. Cookbooks from the 1940s through the 1970s praised it under crispy chicken secrets and roast tips. It took a little planning, sure, but the reward was worth it. And best of all, it cost nothing. Whipped evaporated milk for desserts was the poor man's whipped cream, and for some it tasted even better. It came in a can, sat on the shelf for months, and was far cheaper than real cream. To make it work, you chilled the can, poured the thick milk into a bowl, and whipped it hard. Some added sugar or vanilla, but it held its shape without much help. It was not as rich as real cream, but it held firm and had a clean, milky flavor. People used it in mousses, icebox cakes, and pies that needed lift without weight. It popped up in retro cookbooks as a budget topping or emergency fix. During rationing or tight weeks, it was a go-to solution. And for families who grew up with it, the taste still brings back birthdays, bake sales, and simple Sunday treats. Vinegar pie filling thickener was one of those odd tricks that worked better than it had any right to. Older fruit pies often came out runny, too sweet, or flat. A splash of vinegar helped in two ways. First, it cut the sugary taste and brought the fruit's brightness back. Second, it helped the flour or starch bind the filling together. Some even said it helped fruit hold its shape. You saw this most in old apple or berry pies, where just a teaspoon gave the flavor a sharp little kick. It was not something most people noticed, but if it was missing, you could tell. The sharp smell faded in the oven, leaving behind something more balanced. A clean slice, no leaks. Some tricks are bold. This one just did its job, and did it well. Bacon grease as a biscuit fat substitute was not just clever, it was common sense. When butter was too pricey or scarce and shortening was rationed, folks used what was already in the pan. Bacon grease, saved in a can or jar near the stove, became the go-to for biscuits, cornbread, and frying. It added depth, richness, and just a hint of smoke. Strained to remove bits, chilled until firm, it worked like lard and made everything taste better. You saw it in Southern cookbooks, recipe cards, and wartime pamphlets. For many, it was just the way things were done, and if someone threw it out, they probably did not grow up cooking. It was humble, it was honest, and it made unforgettable biscuits. Soda pop in cake batter sounds like a kid's prank, but for decades it was a real kitchen trick, and one that actually worked. When families were short on eggs, butter, or milk, they found that a can of cola or lemon lime soda added not just sweetness, but airiness to boxed cake mixes. The bubbles acted like a leavening agent, giving the batter a lift and a fluffiness that surprised even skeptical bakers. Lemon lime soda went into yellow cakes and cupcakes, while cola paired beautifully with chocolate. The result was a moist, tender crumb that needed no buttercream to be good. Sometimes people would even mix flavored gelatin powder into the batter to amp up the color and make it match the soda. Bright pink for strawberry soda, green for lime, orange for, well, orange. It was part dessert, part science experiment, and always a hit at potlucks and school parties. You would find versions of this in cookbooks with titles like Fun with Cake Mixes or Desserts for a Crowd. Even today, some bakers swear it is the fastest way to get a light, fluffy cake without worrying about what is in the fridge. And they are not wrong. Peanut butter and meatloaf might sound like a dare, but in the mid-century kitchen, it was just another thrifty trick. Ground beef was expensive, especially when you were trying to feed more mouths than you had meat. So home cooks started mixing in all sorts of things to bulk it up. Breadcrumbs, oats, mashed beans, and yes, peanut butter. A few spoonfuls of peanut butter made the mixture stickier and easier to mold, added a little fat for moisture, and brought a nutty depth that some people genuinely came to love. The flavor was subtle, not overpowering, and often paired with ketchup or tomato sauce on top to balance it out. You would find this idea popping up in wartime rationing cookbooks and community recipe swaps, usually in the margins with little notes like "kids did not notice" or "husband approved." It was especially popular in places where peanuts were cheap and beef was not. These meatloaves were humble, hearty, and surprisingly flavorful, and when baked right, they held together beautifully. The next time you are low on ingredients and high on curiosity, try it. You might understand why people kept doing it even after the war ended. Cornflake coating for fried foods was one of those budget miracles that came out of a box. When breadcrumbs were scarce or you just wanted something different, people turned to cornflakes, those same flakes they poured in a bowl for breakfast each morning. Crushed into fine crumbs and tossed with a little salt or paprika, cornflakes made a crunchy, golden coating that worked on everything from chicken to pork chops to fish sticks. You did not need a deep fryer either, just a baking tray, a little oil, and a hot oven. Some versions used a milk and egg wash first, while others went straight from the cornflake crumbs to the pan. The coating crisped up quickly and stayed put, giving each bite a satisfying crunch. This trick was especially common in the 1950s and 1960s, when convenience met creativity, and boxed cereals found their way into more than just the breakfast table. Kids loved it, adults called it clever, and it quietly became one of the best shortcuts in the American kitchen. Even gluten-free folks today still swear by it. The box said breakfast, but old cookbooks knew better. Vinegar in meringue stabilizer might not be the most glamorous kitchen tip, but it saved more pies than you can count. Mid-century bakers hated one thing above all else: weepy meringue. That sad little puddle that formed between the lemon filling and the fluffy white top was the enemy. So what did they do? They turned to vinegar. Just a teaspoon, mixed into the whipped egg whites, helped hold the structure, giving the meringue more strength and preventing collapse. It tightened the proteins, firmed up the peaks, and made for a glossier, more dependable finish. You would find this note in the tiny print of pie recipes, usually accompanied by tips like bake at low temp or spread meringue all the way to crust. It was a behind-the-scenes trick, never advertised but always appreciated. Home bakers might not have understood the science, but they knew it worked. And in an era when homemade pies were still a point of pride, a clean slice was everything. Sometimes the best tricks were the quiet ones, the ones that just made you look like you knew exactly what you were doing. Tomato juice as a soup-based starter was one of those ideas that seemed too simple to matter, until you tried it. When canned broth was hard to find or too expensive, people needed something flavorful, shelf-stable, and easy to stretch. Tomato juice fit the bill perfectly. It added color, acidity, and a rich, savory base that made even the most basic vegetable soup taste like it had simmered for hours. It was especially popular in the 1940s and 1950s, when canned juices were lining grocery shelves and meat was either rationed or just plain pricey. Recipes would call for a cup of tomato juice, some diced potatoes or cabbage, and maybe a scoop of rice or beans. Suddenly, dinner was done. You could serve it with crackers or cornbread, or even pour it over noodles if you had them. It was quick, clean, and cost next to nothing. Some families even poured leftover tomato juice from canned tomatoes right into the pot. Waste not, want not. These soups were humble, but they were hearty, and sometimes that is all you needed, especially when times were tight. Bread crust pie lattice was the ultimate make-do solution for bakers who hated to waste a single scrap. Instead of tossing out the crusts from sliced sandwich bread, especially the heels, home cooks braided or layered them across the top of a pie. You would soak the crusts briefly in a little milk or brush them with melted butter to soften them up, then shape them into rustic strips. They would toast up golden in the oven and give the pie a rough, homemade charm that you just could not fake. It was not flaky like traditional crust, but it held its shape and added a chewy, buttery layer to each slice. This trick showed up in Depression era and wartime cookbooks as a way to conserve flour, since making a second crust from scratch was not always an option. It worked best on fruit pies or pudding pies that needed a topping but did not require full coverage. You would be surprised how many old-timers still remember this with a kind of fondness, those scrappy little pies made with crusts no one wanted. And the best part? It actually tasted pretty good. Saltine cracker pie crust was the quiet hero of the no-frills American dessert scene. Before graham crackers took over, home bakers turned to what they had, plain old saltines. Crushed up, mixed with sugar and melted margarine, and pressed into a pie dish, these humble crackers transformed into a sturdy, slightly salty base that balanced sweet fillings beautifully. You would find this crust holding up lemon chiffon pies, coconut cream, and even banana pudding. The salt gave it a surprising edge, cutting through all the sugar and keeping things from tasting one note. Sometimes cooks would toast it in the oven before adding the filling, just to give it extra crunch. And while it never became a household staple like graham cracker crusts, it held on as a clever trick among thrifty bakers. If your pantry was low and your guests were coming soon, this crust saved the day. It tasted like ingenuity, like making dessert work even when you were one step from out of options. That was the kind of creativity that turned crackers into cornerstones. Mashed potato donuts were a wartime favorite that combined comfort, frugality, and just enough indulgence. They started as a way to use up leftover mashed potatoes, especially the cold, sticky kind no one wanted to reheat. Mixed with flour, sugar, eggs, and spices, the dough was rolled out, cut into rings, and fried until golden. The potatoes made them tender on the inside, with a crisp outer shell that held up well to a dusting of powdered sugar or a quick dip in glaze. The texture was somewhere between a cake donut and a fritter, and they were surprisingly filling. These showed up in cookbooks throughout the 1940s and 1950s, usually listed under budget baking or no-waste desserts. They were popular at church events, bake sales, and family breakfasts, where everyone needed something sweet and satisfying. People even used boxed instant mashed potatoes when real ones were in short supply. It was not just about saving money, it was about turning scraps into something worth looking forward to. And in kitchens where not a spoonful could be wasted, these donuts made every bite count. Shredded carrot in gelatin salads was a strange but oddly elegant touch that showed up all over mid-century kitchens. Back when gelatin was not just dessert, but a full-blown meal format, People like to add texture and color to their wobbly molds. Enter the humble carrot, shredded fine and stirred into orange or lemon gelatin for a bright, crunchy twist. The sweetness of the gelatin and the mild earthiness of the carrot balanced surprisingly well, and the end result was a chilled salad that looked like sunshine on a plate. You would find it served at potlucks, funerals, church luncheons, and any meal where presentation mattered more than explanation. Sometimes folks added pineapple or raisins too, giving it a sweet-sour profile that people either loved or politely ignored. Still, the shredded carrot stuck around because it was easy, inexpensive, and made the mold feel a little more like food and less like decoration. It is one of those dishes people remember from their grandmother's house, even if they never quite liked it. But in its own weird way, it was beautiful. Oatmeal meat extender was one of the smartest tricks to come out of wartime cooking, and one of the least noticed. The idea was simple. Take a little meat and make it go further by adding rolled oats. Mixed with ground beef, eggs, and seasonings, the oats absorbed flavor, held moisture, and blended in so well that most people did not even notice. They made the meat stretch without sacrificing texture, and they were cheap, filling, and always on hand. This trick became especially common in meatloaf, burgers, and even meatballs, anywhere a little extra bulk was needed. Cookbooks from the 1930s and 1940s praised it as a nutritious alternative or thrift-friendly filler. Some families used it so often that it just became the default. You might even say the oats carried the meal without getting credit. That is what made it brilliant. It was not flashy, but it worked. And when you were feeding 6 people on a 2-pound package of meat, that quiet brilliance made all the difference. Celery salt on cottage cheese might not sound like much, but for mid-century dieters, it was a little miracle. In the 1950s, cottage cheese was hailed as the queen of health foods, low in fat, high in protein, and endlessly adaptable. But let us be honest, it was bland. Enter celery salt. Just a dash gave it a briny, herby kick that made the whole bowl come alive. It was cheap, shelf-stable, and sprinkled on everything from tomato slices to hard-boiled eggs. But with cottage cheese, it had a real glow-up. This combo became a go-to lunch for housewives watching their waistlines, often served on lettuce with half a pear or a canned peach on top. It looked like a diet plate, but tasted like something more satisfying. You could find this suggestion in health columns, diet booklets, and women's magazines from coast to coast. It was a trick born of scarcity and self-restraint, dressed up to feel like something fancier. Even today, a bite of cottage cheese with a little celery salt feels like stepping into a lunch counter from 70 years ago. Quiet, cool, and just a little strange. Milk toast for sick days was as gentle as food could get. It was the go-to recovery meal when your stomach was queasy, your appetite was gone, or you just needed something soft and warm. The idea was simple. Toast a slice of plain bread, place it in a shallow bowl, and pour over warm milk, sometimes sweetened with a bit of sugar, sometimes sprinkled with cinnamon. The toast softened into something halfway between soup and cereal, easy to eat and even easier to digest. For generations, this was comfort food in its purest form, especially for children, the elderly, and anyone too worn out to chew. You would find it in vintage home nurse guides, cookbooks for invalids, and even school health manuals. It was not flashy, not flavorful, but it came with a kind of tenderness that people remembered long after they recovered. A spoonful of milk toast felt like someone tucking you in. In a world full of rich broths and fancy juices, sometimes all you needed was bread, milk, and a quiet moment to rest. Onion soup mix as meat marinade was one of the first true pantry hacks, and it came straight from a packet. Long before marinades came in bottled form, cooks reached for those little paper envelopes of instant onion soup mix and stirred them into everything. With just water and maybe a splash of oil, the mix became a tangy, deeply savory coating for chicken thighs, pot roast, or even pork chops. The salt, the dehydrated onion, the herbs, it was like magic in a bag. Suddenly, your dinner tasted slow-cooked without needing a spice rack. It became a staple in slow cookers, Sunday roasts, and midweek dinners that needed to feed six with not much to work with. The mix was cheap, available everywhere, and lasted practically forever in a drawer. Cookbooks and food ads praised it as flavor in minutes, and they were not wrong. Even now, some of the best meatloaf recipes still sneak in a packet. It was the kind of trick that made you look like a kitchen genius, even when all you did was open a box. Prune whip dessert was the fiber-rich cloud that showed up at church luncheons and retirement homes across the country. It was sweet, airy, and oddly elegant, made by pureeing stewed prunes, folding them into stiffly beaten egg whites, and chilling the whole thing until it held its shape. It sounds strange now, but it was a hit in the 1930s through the 1950s, especially with older folks or anyone on a digestive diet. Prunes were cheap, shelf-stable, and full of nutrients, and this dessert made them feel like a treat instead of medicine. Some cooks added a bit of lemon juice or vanilla for brightness, while others served it with a dollop of whipped evaporated milk or even custard. The result was light on the tongue and surprisingly satisfying, especially if you had grown tired of gelatin molds. It was not a dish that screamed decadence, but it whispered health, comfort, and just a little bit of sweetness. The kind you served to someone who needed a gentle dessert and a moment of peace. Oven-dried breadcrumb savor was less of a recipe and more of a way of life. Any time you had bread that went stale, and back then, that was often, you dried it out in the oven, crushed it by hand, and stored it for later. Nothing got tossed. These homemade crumbs were used for coating fish, thickening soups, binding meatloaf, and topping baked casseroles. A batch could last weeks if you kept it dry and cool. Some people seasoned them with herbs or garlic powder, while others kept them plain and let the dish carry the flavor. Cookbooks from the 1940s and 1950s listed breadcrumbs as an everyday ingredient, not something you bought at the store. They called them pantry gold and treated them with care. It was a small step toward stretching every meal and making use of everything, and it came with that quiet pride of not letting good food go to waste. These crumbs had a texture you could not get from store-bought. More rustic, more honest. They turned the ordinary into something that felt home-cooked and personal. Leftover cereal meat coating was a trick that came straight from the back of the box. When breadcrumbs were out and cornflakes had already gone into yesterday's casserole, cooks got creative with whatever dry cereal they had left. Bran flakes, crisped rice, even plain puffed wheat. They were all crushed, seasoned, and pressed into service as a meat coating. The idea was to roll a cutlet or drumstick in milk or egg, then dredge it through crushed cereal to make a crunchy crust. It was cheaper, often healthier, and surprisingly effective. Some people added parmesan or paprika to the mix to boost the flavor, while others liked the sweetness it brought to pork or chicken. Kids never questioned it, especially if the cereal had been part of breakfast just that morning. These tricks were passed down in hand-me-down cookbooks and on recipe cards that started with, "Use what you have." And that is really what it was about, making dinner work without running to the store. Sometimes the best recipes came from the bottom of the box. Orange juice glazed carrots were the kind of dinner party dish that felt fancier than it was. Carrots were cheap and easy to store, but no one really got excited about them until you added a splash of orange juice and a bit of butter. The acid in the juice softened the carrots just right, while the sugars caramelized slightly, giving everything a glossy finish. It made a plain root vegetable taste bright, warm, and a little unexpected. This trick started appearing in cookbooks in the 1950s and really caught on in the 1960s when citrus became a trendy flavor in savory foods. Some cooks added a dash of honey or cinnamon, while others left it clean and simple. It was easy to make, easy to scale for a crowd, and looked beautiful on the plate. This was the kind of side dish that made people feel like they were eating something a little more refined, even when it cost barely $1 to make. A little citrus went a long way, and carrots never looked back. Canned fruit syrup as sweetener was the secret sauce behind dozens of desserts and drinks when sugar was rationed or expensive. The syrup from canned peaches, pears, or pineapples was thick, sweet, and already full of fruit flavor, so thrifty cooks learned to never throw it away. They poured it into cake batters to replace sugar and milk, used it to thin frosting or sweeten gelatin molds, and even stirred it into coffee or tea. Some recipes called for reducing it slightly on the stovetop to make a more concentrated syrup. Others added cornstarch and used it as a glaze for pound cake or donuts. It was a way to get extra flavor and moisture without using up precious pantry staples. Magazines from the 1940s through the 1970s suggested it often, usually alongside tips for reusing the fruit itself in upside-down cakes or salad toppings. It was a full-circle solution. Nothing wasted, everything sweetened. If you grew up with canned fruit, you probably remember the taste of that syrup more than the peaches themselves. Boiled hamburger patties were never glamorous, but they got the job done. In the name of health, or sometimes just thrift, home cooks were advised to boil their ground beef patties instead of frying them. The idea was to reduce fat and keep the meat moist without needing extra oil. The patties were formed, dropped into gently simmering water or broth, and cooked until firm. The result was softer than a grilled burger, but still surprisingly flavorful, especially if the liquid was seasoned. Some added onions or garlic to the pot to give the meat extra depth, while others used leftover broth for soups later. This method showed up in diet cookbooks, military manuals, and penny-saving guides alike. It was also recommended for feeding young children or the elderly who needed soft, easy-to-chew proteins. It might not have had that backyard burger smell, but it filled a plate just the same. And sometimes, especially during hard times, that was all that mattered. Mashed peas as sandwich spread was one of those strange little inventions that stuck around longer than anyone expected. When meat was scarce and deli slices were a luxury, people turned to vegetables for sandwich fillings. Peas, cooked, mashed, and mixed with mayonnaise or mustard, became a go-to choice. The texture was creamy, the flavor mild and earthy, and the color a cheerful green that stood out on soft white bread. You might find it alongside shredded lettuce, thinly sliced pickles, or even a hard-boiled egg. Sometimes people added a pinch of salt or a splash of vinegar to punch it up. It was not about loving peas, it was about having something hearty to spread between two slices. This trick showed up in wartime and Depression-era lunchbox guides, often marketed as a nutritious, affordable alternative to ham or tuna salad. And oddly enough, for a generation raised on making do, it became a taste they remembered fondly. It was cheap, it was strange, and it worked. Ketchup sandwiches were not a joke back then. They were survival. 2 slices of white bread, a squeeze of ketchup, and that was lunch. When fresh tomatoes were too expensive or gone altogether, the bottle stood in. It was cheap, it was sweet, and it gave just enough tang to fool your brain into thinking you had a real sandwich. Sometimes people would add onions or pickles if they had them, but most of the time it was just the red stuff and bread. And you would be surprised how many kids looked forward to it. It was bright, flavorful, and in a decade where most meals were beige, that mattered more than you would think. Ketchup was a staple condiment because it had a long shelf life and could cover the taste of anything going off. In this case, it became the main event. Parents handed it out with a smile, even if their hearts sank doing it. It was food, and that counted. You might laugh at it today, but in the 1930s, ketchup sandwiches were a reminder that even when the pantry was bare, you could still pretend to eat like everyone else. In the times that were the Depression, there was a dire lack of oil and cooking fat. This meant that the already really tough cuts of meat that people were using, like the shoulders or the back, were even harder to chew and keep down every other day since there was no fat to help them with flavor. On the other hand, people would try to get around this issue by using as much leftover bacon grease as they could. Maybe that's a bit icky for you, but hey, it does help. Plus, they were a lot healthier than we were, so maybe the icks are coming from inside the house. When faced with scarcity, people have a knack for turning what others might discard into something remarkable. Enter souse, a dish born from necessity and ingenuity. Made from pig's feet, ears, and other head parts, souse was a practical solution in a time when wasting food wasn't an option. To create souse, the pig parts were boiled to extract gelatin, then seasoned with vinegar, salt, and spices before being pressed into a jellied loaf. This technique preserved the meat for longer periods in an era before refrigeration and canning existed. Vinegar acted as a natural preservative, ensuring the dish could be stored and transported. With a shelf life like that, souse was an early pioneer in the grab-and-go meal category. Culturally, souse was a staple among rural families, particularly in the South and Appalachia, where food preservation was vital for survival. Nutritionally, it was a surprising powerhouse, rich in protein, collagen, and calcium. But let's not sugarcoat it. Making souse was messy, requiring patience and a strong stomach, yet resourcefulness triumphed, turning scraps into sustenance. Hominy was a humble kitchen staple during the Great Depression, and it stretched far and wide. Hominy puffed up into soft, chewy nuggets made by soaking dried corn kernels in lye. Yes, lye, and as versatile as they were filling. Hominy may not have been glamorous, but it did the job. Hominy made its way into soups, casseroles, and even as a side dish fried. A texture party, it gave simple meals a satisfying chew. It became the base for Southern favorites like grits for those who could afford a little extra seasoning. It was a hearty, starchy savior on lean days for everyone else. Hominy was often prepared in large batches, which they dried and stored for future use. This wasn't just food, it was an investment for the long term, so you wouldn't go hungry. Making hominy wasn't exactly convenient, but it was worth it when food supplies were low. Hominy is still a staple in some cuisines, but it's long since faded from everyday American tables. But for those who lived through the Great Depression, this unassuming corn product was a lifeline. And once again, necessity is the mother of culinary invention. Man, when I tell you tinned salmon had people addicted, you might not believe me. But really, for a time in the 50s, this was all people were eating. See, back then, fishing culture was a real thing. I mean, actual fishing culture, you know? Get a net, get your line and reel, and go to the nearest river, pond, or other undisturbed body of water and go get started. Hey, some kids even used to fish crayfish and cod out of the rivers with their hands. Salmon was actually incredibly easy to catch. It was a lot more common than you might think. Tinned salmon took advantage of the fact that it was becoming such a natural hit with the people and just really sliding into their palates comfortably. John West, Bumblebee, and Clover Leaf were all brands that were making their name in the 50s and established themselves as top-tier competitors by the later decades. You could get different kinds of salmon too, and you could even get ones with soft bones if a bit of extra calcium is what you're looking for. Of course, the rich people would only ever eat fresh salmon with a bechamel sauce or something, but working folks settled for pleasure out of a can. Boiled bread dumplings were a Depression lifesaver when meat was gone and vegetables were thin. Families took stale bread, ends or crusts, and soaked them in water or milk until soft. Then they added flour, maybe an egg, and salt or onion. This got rolled into dumplings and boiled until firm. They soaked up broth and stretched soups into meals that could feed 5 instead of 2. The texture was dense, like a sponge that clung to every drop of flavor. Sometimes they were served with just gravy or fat drippings. They were not pretty, but they filled you up and gave the illusion of plenty. And in a time when illusions were all you had, that meant something. Bread dumplings turned trash into dinner, and that was enough. Repurposing old clothes helped a lot too. Lots of families would basically live off of hand-me-downs and reused clothes that needed a bit of work. They'd take a sweater, sew up the holes on it, trade a potato for some shoelaces, stuff like that. While of course today we get the privilege of not having to go that far, we can still take a page out of their book. Clothes are meant to be reused and worn again and again, and I'm sorry if TikTok brain rot has convinced you that you need to constantly update your wardrobe so you can serve looks every single time you step out. It's okay. Wear the black tee again. No one is going to care. When summer heat bore down on farmers in the 18th and 19th centuries, they turned to a surprisingly simple drink to keep going. Known as switchel or haymaker's punch, this tangy, slightly sweet beverage was the Gatorade of its time. Long before energy drinks came in aluminum cans, switchel offered hydration and a quick dose of electrolytes to workers in the fields. Its ingredients were humble but effective: water, vinegar, molasses or maple syrup, and ginger. Together, they created a drink that was as refreshing as it was restorative. The beauty of Switchel lay in its accessibility. Every ingredient was easy to source, even for struggling farmers. Vinegar, often homemade, was a staple in most households, and molasses was an affordable sweetener compared to refined sugar. Fresh ginger might have been trickier to come by in some regions, but dried or powdered versions could be substituted, proving that necessity truly is the mother of invention. Nutritionally, Switchel was more than a thirst quencher. The vinegar provided potassium, the molasses added iron, and ginger soothed the stomach. As practical as it was, this wasn't a drink of luxury. It lacked the fizz of modern sodas or the elegance of iced tea, but what it lacked in sophistication, it made up for in down-to-earth resilience. Hardtack, also known as the cracker that could survive the apocalypse, was a Depression-era favorite for those wanting to stockpile something that wouldn't spoil. It was a rock-hard biscuit made of nothing but flour, water, maybe a pinch of salt. Nothing special, but dependable. Hardtack was a legacy food, one with military rations and sailor diets pedigree. It was a Depression-era hit because families could stash it in pantries without fear of spoilage. Plain, it was like gnawing on a brick. It was almost edible, but softened with soup, milk, or coffee, it became almost edible. Emphasis on almost. Hardtack was bland, but there was something charming about it. It was cheap, easy to make, and incredibly filling. It was the base for many families' meals when ingredients were scarce. It thickened stews, broken into crumbs, or was an impromptu plate when real dishware wasn't an option, left whole. Today, hardtack is more of a historical curiosity than a pantry must-have. However, during the Great Depression, this humble cracker represented resilience. It wasn't fancy or flavorful, but it kept people going when times were tough, and that's what mattered. If the idea of cow brain stew makes you squirm, just think about eating it because you had no other choice. Even during the Great Depression, even cow brains were fair game in the fight against hunger. Surprisingly, they weren't just edible. In some circles, they were considered a delicacy. The process of making cow brain stew was meticulous. Brains had to be carefully cleaned to remove any membranes and then gently cooked to avoid an overly rubbery texture. Once seasoned and simmered, the resulting stew had a smooth, creamy consistency that was somewhat comforting. It was silky, almost custard-like, and possibly that's why some people actually liked it. The brain was usually served over rice or potatoes and made one brain into a meal for a family. Cow brain was nutritionally a powerhouse of protein and vitamins and was a valuable food source in lean times. The idea of eating brains didn't exactly have much popularity, and as soon as more appealing options were offered, cow brain stew fell out of favor. Interestingly, in some cultures, eating brain meat was considered a delicacy long before the Depression. For example, certain European and Asian dishes have celebrated cow brains as a prized food item. But as food options became more plentiful and tastes evolved, cow brain stew faded into the background, becoming a curious relic of a time when necessity ruled the dinner plate. These days, cow brain stew is more likely to be a dare than a dinner table. Back then, it was a lifesaver, proving that humans can eat anything, even when the going gets tough. People back in the Depression had one thing over us by miles. They had a stronger communal spirit. Sharing equipment wasn't strange at all for them, and in fact, was literally a vital part of their daily routine and life. Sharing expensive equipment such as lawnmowers, vacuums, straighteners, dryers, all of that was really common. It meant that people could save on their electricity bill and also build up some goodwill. You borrow something from your neighbor, then the next time they need something, you lend it to them. The end result? Both of you get your money up. Hardtack with gravy was a way of reviving something almost too tough to chew into something soft and sustaining. Hardtack, that old sailor's biscuit made of just flour and water, was shelf-stable and cheap. You could find it in army rations and emergency pantries, and in the Great Depression, people brought it back out of necessity. By itself, it was like biting into a brick. But soak it in milk or water, then smother it in gravy or fat, and suddenly you had something warm and edible. The gravy could be made from bacon drippings, flour, and whatever seasonings you had on hand. Sometimes people would stir in bits of onion or mashed beans to bulk it out. The result was soft, salty, and just enough like dinner to satisfy. Kids might not have loved it, but they learned to eat it fast. It filled you up and made good use of food that was meant to last forever. In hard times, that mattered. Hardtack with gravy was a lesson in patience, in chewing, and in making do with what you had, even if what you had was practically stone. Is this the most metal dinner of the Great Depression? Boiled sheep's head, a meal so intense it had its own built-in stare-down. Folks did indeed boil an entire sheep's head. And no, this is not just urban legend. The head was thoroughly cleaned, seasoned, and simmered for hours until tender. The result? A dish rich in fat, where no part of the animal was wasted. The broth, cheeks, tongue, and eyeballs were all considered delicacies. Good liquid gold for soups or stews. Why eat sheep's head? When money was tight, every scrap of protein was important, and the head had a surprising amount of meat. The families gathered around the table, picking it clean and making the best of what they had. Boiled sheep's head might sound horrifying to modern sensibilities, but for those who could turn something unappealing into a meal worth savoring, it was a source of pride. It was also a lesson in sustainability long before sustainability became a trendy thing. These days, it's a rare dish, but in some cultures, it's a culinary tradition that lives on. Though honestly, some people decided to save things up and go home instead. For a week or two, just to relax, you know? Anyway, at home, people's diets were changing in yet another way once again. Top round roasts were a really good example of this. They were something you would get from the round, primal cut of beef, and they were a really common voice for most families that wanted to eat on a reasonable budget. Hey, if you try to weasel your way out of buying good meat, you often end up with bad and tough cuts that are almost like rubber to chew, and no one wants that. Top round roasts were so nice and popular exactly because they were an affordable lean cut, a previously never-before-seen phenomena in the lands of the United States. This lean cut was something that was really adaptable too. You can make it in all kinds of cooking methods. You could roast it, slow cook it, grill it, or even make a patty out of it. Plus, for $1.50 per pound, who was really competing with stuff like this? I mean, sure, it was no ribeye, but at least you had a roast to come back to. That's why people would save up and go home, because at some point, the ramen noodles start to get really old. I never knew fat could be the unsung hero of the Great Depression. Sweet, the solid white fat from the loins or kidneys of sheep and cows, was much more than a pantry staple. It was a survival tool. Sweat was once prized for its versatility, being used in cooking, baking, and even non-food uses such as making candles and soap. When resources were scarce and people had to make the most of every morsel, it was the original all-in-one solution. Sweat was a game-changer in the kitchen. It gave the dishes of meat pies, puddings, and dumplings richness, which helped to make them hearty enough to stretch a meal for an entire family. During the colder months, when energy reserves were important, its high-calorie content made it essential. Suet wasn't just for savory dishes either, with recipes like suet pudding turning this otherwise savory staple into a sweet one. In addition to its utility, suet was available. It was often considered a byproduct by butchers and sold cheaply, so even the most cash-strapped families could afford it. It was also easy to render and store and kept for months when properly handled. Suet has pretty much disappeared from modern kitchens, but it occasionally makes an appearance in traditional recipes. It was more than just fat to those who lived through the Great Depression. It was a lifeline in Lard's clothing. Lima bean stew was one of those one-pot miracles that got families through the leanest stretches of the 1930s. Dried lima beans were cheap, easy to store, and when soaked and cooked slowly, they turned creamy and rich. Families would simmer them all day with scraps of carrot, onion, or potato, whatever they could find. If they had bacon grease or lard, a spoonful added body. If not, salt and thyme would do the job. There was no recipe, just instinct and adaptation. Sometimes the beans were mashed into a thick paste, sometimes left whole and floating in broth. The stew could stretch over 2 or even 3 days, especially if you kept adding water or leftover vegetables. Kids might complain, but mothers knew. This pot was the difference between full and hungry. In many homes, the smell of beans bubbling away was a kind of comfort. It meant there would be something to eat tonight. It was frugal food with just enough warmth to feel like dinner. In hard times, lima bean stew taught you patience, resourcefulness, and the power of cooking what you had, not what you wished for. Taking cold showers is a wonderful little thing you can do to help cut down the cost of that electricity. Those water heaters actually take a lot more power than you might be aware of. People during the Depression also got into the habit of counting what uses their electricity and how much gets wasted. That's why wherever they could, and whenever it was safe to, they would typically just use cold showers instead of hot ones. You have to leave it on for quite a while to warm it up too, so that's really just an hour of electricity you're saving up on. In the days when tools doubled as cookware, a simple flatbread became a staple for pioneers and enslaved people alike. Hoe cake, named for the garden hoe it was traditionally cooked on, embodies practicality at its finest. A mixture of cornmeal, water, and a pinch of salt, this humble bread was both quick to make and filling. It was the perfect companion for those with limited resources and even less time. And yes, they really did cook it on a hoe over an open fire. Talk about multitasking. Cornmeal, the main ingredient, was abundant and affordable, making it a cornerstone of American diets in the 18th and 19th centuries. Corn didn't require refrigeration, and a sack of meal could last for months if kept dry. Unlike wheat flour, which was more expensive and prone to pests, cornmeal was durable and versatile. Hoe cakes could be whipped up in minutes, whether on a farm, at a campsite, or beside a battlefield. Culturally, hoe cakes were a symbol of endurance. Enslaved communities relied on them as a cheap, energy-rich food, while soldiers in the Revolutionary War used them as portable sustenance. Kraut juice. It's just what it sounds like. During the Great Depression, fermented cabbage brine was a go-to pantry item, prized for its versatility and surprising nutritional benefits. It was a byproduct of sauerkraut making, and wasting it was out of the question. Straight down the throat for its purported health benefits as a cooking liquid for soups and stews, or even as a splash to bland foods to add flavor. Basically, it was the Depression-era version of an electrolyte drink, thought to help digestion and keep people going when fresh produce was scarce. But the taste was divisive. You either loved it or learned to tolerate it. Kraut juice had its good points too. It was cheap, it kept forever, and it was surprisingly rich in vitamins and probiotics. It was a lifeline in a jar for families with limited resources. Kraut juice has faded from the household staple, but it hasn't gone away altogether. Some old-school recipes still use it, and occasionally it's sipped as a health tonic. For the people who lived through the Great Depression, kraut juice wasn't a health trend. It was a necessity. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked, one briny sip at a time. In the 90s, in that overwhelming decade of innovation, a lot of new things were coming to light. Cracker crust pizza was one of them, and it kind of follows the same concept as slumgullion stew, where the idea is to really just use whatever's on hand to make do. This was something that was a frugal twist on an all-time favorite. See, households had the idea to ditch the yeast and the entire waiting process. You'd usually have to wait a fair bit to see the dough start to rise. The alternative was using transformed crackers as a DIY makeshift pizza base. A box of crackers was something that literally did run you only 50 cents, and a can of tomato sauce and the most affordable cheese in the mart were also inflicting any serious damage on your budget. The dish was something that helped deal with the effects of inflation, which was honestly the biggest reason why families had to resort to meals like this. Minimal ingredients and almost no preparation time meant that cracker crust pizzas became an accessible way to get your pizza cravings fixed. They were able to mimic the taste of it well enough at a quarter of the cost. I don't know about you, but personally, that alone would make it start tasting better for me. This was something that really popped off in dorms with college students, though. They'd get up to cheap pizza nights on a first-year student's budget that way. During the Depression, it was extremely common for lots of households to be out of detergent. When they would do their laundry, they would instead use vinegar to get rid of any unpleasant odors and soften their clothes. It would help in saving bills because vinegar was a lot easier to get and a lot more affordable than detergent was. Plus, it would last just as long, if not longer. You wouldn't need to take an extreme amount of the stuff anyway, and hey, if it works for cat pee, I think it'll do wonders for a bunch of sweat stains on your shirt. Breadcrumb stuffing without meat was not just a holiday thing in the 1930s, it was a year-round filler. When families had no sausage, no giblets, and sometimes no roast at all, they would take stale bread, tear it up, and moisten it with water or broth. If you had a little onion or celery, that went in too. The whole mess got baked until crisp on top and soft inside, and it tasted like something far fancier than it was. This was Depression cooking at its cleverest. The trick was to use whatever you had to stretch the meal. Sometimes the bread was barely held together with a bit of egg or flour paste. Sometimes it was just bread, salt, and hope. But it filled bellies, and that was what mattered most. People called it stuffing, even if there was nothing to stuff. It would sit in the center of the table like a roast if need be. Some families even sliced it cold the next day and fried it up like savory cake. It was warm, it was simple, and it helped people feel like they still had something special to share. That was the magic of it. Plain food pretending to be more. In the days before canning, families had to get creative when it came to preserving food through the winter months. Root cellar stew emerged as a practical solution, utilizing vegetables and meats stored in cool, dark root cellars, nature's version of a modern-day freezer. A basic root cellar stew often featured potatoes, carrots, onions, and turnips, all of which were stored in a root cellar to stay fresh for months. A hearty mix of preserved meats, often dried or salted, added flavor and substance. These ingredients were cheap, accessible, and nutritious, ideal for feeding a family through lean times. Farmers had an abundance of root vegetables in the fall, which made this dish a natural choice for colder months. The secret to root cellar stew's long-lasting appeal lay in its simplicity and the preservation techniques available. The cool, stable temperature of a root cellar allowed vegetables to be kept without spoilage, while preserved meats added essential protein. Stews could be left simmering for hours, developing deep, savory flavors. This dish also provided key nutrients needed to stave off winter illnesses, making it both a practical and cultural staple. When the Great Depression hit, sorghum syrup ruled the roost as the king of sweeteners, honey maple syrup be damned. This thick, golden brown liquid was made by boiling down the juice of sorghum cane, and it was a lifeline for families trying to sweeten their lives without breaking the bank. It was affordable and versatile enough to earn a permanent place in Depression-era pantries. Sorghum syrup was not just a sweetener, it was a source of vital nutrients such as iron, calcium, and magnesium. It wasn't just tasty, it was functional, in an era when balanced meals were often a luxury. Sorghum on a biscuit, cornbread, or oatmeal could make a meager breakfast something special. It even made its way into sauces, marinades, baked goods, and even into ice cream. Sorghum syrup production was a community affair. During harvest time, people gathered in entire neighborhoods to crush sorghum stalks and boil the juice into syrup. It was labor-intensive, but it was also social, and it forged bonds even in the darkest of times. Back then, it wasn't about foodie trends, but today, sorghum syrup is experiencing a small renaissance in the culinary world. It was about survival, resourcefulness, and getting as much goodness as we could out of the land. Sorghum syrup wasn't just a treat for Depression-era families. It was a symbol of sweetness that endured in hard times. Fried cornmeal mush cakes were born from the same pot twice. You would make cornmeal mush, just cornmeal, water, maybe a pinch of salt, let it set in a pan overnight, and slice it into firm pieces the next day. Then you fried those slices in grease until the edges crisped up like polenta. It was crunchy on the outside, soft on the inside, and just enough to fool you into thinking you were eating something indulgent. Back in the 1930s, this was how you stretched a single meal into two. The mush might have been dinner one night and breakfast the next morning. Some people served it with syrup or molasses, while others went savory and added onions or lard. There was no right or wrong. It was all about using what was left. You did not throw anything out, especially not a whole pot of cooled mush. It became a habit, a ritual, even a comfort. Children would dunk the crispy slices in milk or eat them straight from the pan. It was Depression-era cooking at its most honest. Plain ingredients, repurposed with care, turned into something worth looking forward to. In the 1970s, almost every kind of home, especially the ones that didn't have a lot of income to work with, whether they were situated in urban centers or rural outskirts, relied on basically just winging it. Recipes had to be flexible and adaptable, and the ingredients in them had to have easy and cheap substitutes. A pound of pasta may have just been a few dollars, but it was something that would last you for so many meals. Beans, on the other hand, were as cheap as they could get. For around 50 cents or $1, you could have an entire can. Mayonnaise wasn't ever something you would associate with pasta or beans, but that's exactly where we're going. The funny thing about being broke is it can make you part with tradition real fast. Even Italian traditionalists that would, in any other circumstance, be pretty opinionated about the use of mayonnaise in pasta would have it that way with beans. You could have a creamy dressing that turned pasta into something more, and it was also something that let families experiment and see what works best for them. You could find it all over the South and North. Instead of one specific city, this dish simply just endured throughout the country. Share your favorite forgotten trick in the comments, give us a like, and hit subscribe so you never miss a bite of history.